Understood. Every single word, including the hook and the CTA, written in English. The Vietnamese CTA instruction said to invite viewers, so I will write that invitation in English as well. Starting now, no Vietnamese anywhere. The most feared name in Seoul's criminal underworld belonged to a man who could no longer button his own shirt. Kang Tae-hyun, 34 years old, boss of the Black Phoenix Syndicate, controller of billions. And now, trembling in private, crumbling behind locked doors, watching everything violence had built begin to collapse under the weight of a disease that answered to no one. His enemies were sharpening their knives. His own men were quietly choosing sides. And then a 4-year-old girl walked through a door she was never supposed to open and said the 7 words that would destroy him more completely than any bullet ever could. Stay until the very end. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Otto. The trembling started in his left hand. It was barely noticeable at first, a faint vibration, like a phone set to silent tucked inside a coat pocket. Tae-hyun had told himself it was fatigue. He had told himself it was stress, the accumulated pressure of running an empire that existed simultaneously in 2 worlds. The legitimate world of Kong Capital Holdings, with its glass towers and quarterly reports, and charitable foundations with his mother's name on the lobby wall. And the other world, the one that never appeared in financial disclosures, the one where debts were collected in ways that didn't involve attorneys or courtrooms or anything resembling mercy. He had told himself many things over the past 8 months. Dr. Shin Woo-jin had told him the truth. Progressive neurological degeneration. The doctor had used those exact words, sitting across from Tae-hyun in the private examination room of a clinic that didn't keep records under real names. The fluorescent lights hummed. The ventilation system breathed its recycled air. Outside the frosted window, Seoul moved in its relentless rhythm. 10 million lives entirely indifferent to the fact that the man sitting in that chair was being systematically dismantled from the inside. How long? Tae-hyun said. Not a question, a demand. Dr. Shin removed his glasses and cleaned them with the slow, deliberate movements of a man buying himself a few extra seconds. The progression varies considerably between patients. Some maintain significant motor function for several years with proper management and rest. Others, how long before I can't walk? The doctor stopped cleaning his glasses. He set them on the desk between them and looked at Tae-hyun. The way men look at other men when they've decided honesty is the only remaining kindness available. Without significant lifestyle modification and consistent treatment, 18 months, possibly less. Tae-hyun had said nothing. He sat in that chair for a long moment, looking at the prescription printout on the desk between them, and then he folded it once, twice, tucked it into the breast pocket of his suit jacket, stood up with the controlled steadiness of a man who had spent 34 years ensuring that no one ever witnessed a single moment of weakness, and walked out. He didn't make another appointment. That had been 4 months ago. The mansion sat on a private ridge above the Han River, shielded from the city below by 3 perimeters of security, reinforced glass, and the kind of silence that money purchases in bulk. Tae-hyun had acquired it 7 years ago from a disgraced politician who needed certain documents to disappear faster than the courts were moving. The exchange had been efficient and mutually beneficial, as most of Tae-hyun's arrangements tended to be. He had renovated every room, replaced every surface, installed systems and protocols that his head of security, a former military intelligence officer named Baek Jun-seo, referred to in briefings simply as the perimeter. The perimeter had never been breached. In the weeks after Dr. Shin's diagnosis, Tae-hyun began adding layers. He reduced his public appearances to the absolute minimum required for maintaining the legitimate side of the empire. He conducted syndicate business exclusively through Jun-seo and 2 senior lieutenants he had trusted for over a decade, men who understood that loyalty was not a sentiment but a professional arrangement with clearly defined consequences for violation. He canceled social engagements. He stopped taking calls from the women who had circulated through his life with the reliability of seasons, beautiful and transactional, and ultimately interchangeable. He was constructing a new fortress, not of concrete and steel this time, of distance. The household staff experienced the shift immediately. There were 11 of them. A head chef named Mr. Park and his 2 assistants, a groundskeeper and his teenage nephew who came on weekends, 3 security personnel who rotated through overnight shifts, a personal assistant named Ms. Yoon, who had been with Tae-hyun since the early days and whose discretion was absolute, and 2 housekeepers responsible for the mansion's upper floors. One of those housekeeping positions had recently become vacant. Ms. Yoon had handled the replacement with her customary efficiency. The candidate she selected, after running 3 rounds of background verification and a personal interview conducted with the thoroughness of a state security clearance, was a woman named Ariana Brooks, 29 years old, American-born, of Nigerian and African-American heritage, raised in Atlanta, currently resident in Seoul for the past 3 years on a valid work visa. References from 2 previous employers, no criminal record, no outstanding debts, no connections, as far as the verification could determine, to any of the criminal organizations that Tae-hyun's network tracked as potential threats. What the background check also noted, and what Ms. Yoon flagged in her briefing document with characteristic precision. Single mother. 1 child, female, age 4. Tae-hyun had read the briefing. He had approved the hire. The child was not relevant. The woman was employed for the 2nd floor, she would maintain professional hours, and personal circumstances were not his concern as long as they didn't intersect with his operations. That was his position in the 3rd week of October. By November, he had revised it. Ariana Brooks arrived each morning at 7:15 and departed by 4 in the afternoon, leaving before the household shifted into its evening configuration. She was thorough and quiet. Ms. Yoon noted in her informal assessments that the 2nd floor had never been maintained with such consistent attention to detail. She didn't engage the security staff in unnecessary conversation. She didn't ask questions she had no professional reason to ask. When she passed Tae-hyun in the hallway, on the rare occasions their schedules overlapped, she greeted him with exactly the appropriate degree of respectful acknowledgement. A nod, sometimes a quiet, "good morning," and continued moving. She had understood the house's atmosphere from her first day. You could feel it in the walls, the specific quality of silence that wasn't peaceful but enforced, the way the security staff moved through corridors with their eyes tracking everything and resting on nothing, the way even Mr. Park, who had worked in professional kitchens for 30 years and had the unbothered confidence that came with genuine mastery, lowered his voice in the East Wing without being told. This was not a home. It was an operational facility that happened to have bedrooms. Ariana had needed the position badly enough not to ask questions about that. She had left Atlanta 3 years earlier with Nia in a car seat in the back of a borrowed vehicle and $400 in cash and the absolute certainty that staying was no longer survivable. Marcus had broken her left wrist in February and her confidence in her own judgment across the 2 years prior to that. The wrist had healed cleaner than the confidence. She had rebuilt both, slowly, imperfectly, with the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided that survival was not enough and that she wanted to actually live. And Seoul had been, against all reasonable expectation, the place where rebuilding had become possible. She had a small apartment in Mapo district. Nia attended a daycare 3 blocks from the apartment that the women on Ariana's previous cleaning crew had recommended. The daycare was run by a Korean grandmother named Mrs. Choi, who had the specific gift of making 4-year-olds feel simultaneously adored and gently accountable, which Ariana considered a form of artistry. The cost of the apartment plus daycare had consumed nearly everything her previous jobs generated. The position at the mansion, the salary Ms. Yoon had named during the interview without flinching, had been the difference between surviving and actually building something. She had not told anyone at work about Nia's existence. It was not information that seemed professionally relevant. It was also not information she was willing to expose to the kind of scrutiny that existed inside a household operating under that level of security. The morning of the 14th of November was rainy in the particular miserable way that Seoul's late autumn specialized in. Not a dramatic storm, but a persistent, cold, gray soaking that made every outdoor surface look abandoned. Ariana had been on the bus to the mansion when Mrs. Choi called. Water damage in the daycare's back room overnight. A pipe had let go sometime around 3 in the morning. The cleanup would take the day. The daycare was closed. Ariana sat on the bus for the remaining 12 minutes of the journey and went through her options with the focused efficiency of someone accustomed to problem-solving under pressure. She had no family in Seoul. The women from her previous crew were all working. The neighbor she trusted with a spare key was in Busan visiting her daughter. Every arrangement she tried to construct in her mind collapsed against the same wall. She had no one available, and she had no option to simply not show up to work at the mansion of Kang Tae-hyun without a consequence she couldn't afford. Nia was asleep in the soft carrier against Ariana's chest, her small face pressed against her mother's collarbone, utterly unbothered by rain or crisis or the impossible arithmetic of a life assembled without a safety net. Ariana made a decision that she knew was a gamble, and took it anyway because the alternative was worse. She brought her daughter to work. She told herself it would be manageable. She had a cleaning cart with a lower shelf where Nia could sit with her backpack of quiet activities, the small stuffed elephant named Gerald, the washable markers, the board books she had memorized well enough to recite from memory. She would keep Nia on the second floor, far from wherever Tae-hyun spent his mornings. She would be in and out of each room efficiently. By noon at the latest, Nia would need a nap, and Ariana could settle her in the small staff lounge on the service level where no one who mattered ever went. For 2 hours, it worked exactly as planned. Nia sat on the cart shelf and drew pictures with her washable markers, and occasionally narrated her drawings in the running, unprompted commentary that was her standard mode of creative engagement. She drew Gerald the elephant fighting a dragon. She drew a house with a rainbow that took up more sky than was architecturally reasonable. She drew what she described as a fish, but also kind of a bird, and seemed entirely satisfied with the ambiguity. Ariana moved through the second-floor rooms with her standard efficiency, keeping one eye on Nia and one eye on the work, and everything was fine. Then Nia needed to use the bathroom. The second-floor bathroom was at the far end of the corridor, past the point where Ariana usually worked. She took Nia by the hand and moved quickly. Nia used the bathroom. Ariana counted the seconds. They were heading back toward the cleaning cart when Nia stopped. "Mama, that door. Don't look at doors, baby. Come on." "But it's open a little." Ariana looked. The door at the end of the north corridor. The door that was always closed. The door that Ms. Yoon had mentioned during orientation with the specific quality of emphasis that meant do not approach under any circumstances, was open, not fully, a few inches. Enough for the thin gray light from inside to fall across the hallway floor in a narrow stripe. "Nia, come." But Nia had already taken 2 steps toward it. Because Nia was 4 years old and a partially open door was, to the 4-year-old mind, an invitation rather than a boundary, and no amount of adult reasoning had yet succeeded in rewiring this fundamental interpretive instinct. "Nia." Ariana's voice was a whisper with a hard edge. She moved toward her daughter. She was 3 steps too slow. Nia pushed the door open with both hands and walked inside. The room was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced the Han River, though the rain had turned the view into gray abstraction. The furniture was sparse and expensive in the way that things are expensive when money is no longer the point. A bed that could have slept 6, a single reading chair positioned to face the windows, a desk with a closed laptop, and nothing else on its surface. The walls were almost bare. Almost, because on the wall to the left of the door, at a height that suggested it had been placed deliberately at eye level while sitting, was a single framed photograph. A woman, older, smiling at something outside the frame with the specific ease of someone who did not know they were being photographed. Kang Tae-hyun was in the reading chair. He was not reading. He was sitting with his left hand braced against his thigh, and he was looking at his right hand, which was held out in front of him, and he was watching it tremble with the focused, furious attention of a man trying to will something into obedience through sheer force of concentration. His jaw was set. The tendons in his neck were visible. He was wearing a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and dark trousers, and there was something about the combination of the perfect clothing and the shaking hand that made the image feel like a fracture, like something that was supposed to hold together had quietly given way. He heard the door. His head came up. His eyes, dark, sharp, carrying the specific cold quality of someone who had survived by maintaining absolute situational awareness at all times, found Nia immediately. For a moment, nothing in the room moved. Nia stood just inside the doorway, her washable marker drawing still smeared faintly on her left hand, her stuffed elephant clutched against her chest, and she looked at Kang Tae-hyun with the direct, unfiltered attention that small children deploy without calculation, because they haven't yet learned that staring is considered an act of aggression. Taehyun's right hand dropped to the arm of the chair. His left hand moved toward the small panel mounted into the armrest, the alarm that would bring Jun Seo and two armed men through the door in under 45 seconds. Nia tilted her head slightly to the left. "Mister," she said, in the clear, unhurried voice of someone with no awareness that this was a situation requiring caution. "Your eyes look lonely." The hand stopped moving. Taehyun stared at the child. The child stared back at him with the calm patience of someone who had said a true thing and was simply waiting for the universe to acknowledge it. Ariana appeared in the doorway behind her daughter, and the expression on her face, the one that contained terror and apology and the specific dread of someone watching a catastrophe unfold in extremely slow motion, told Taehyun everything he needed to know about how this had happened. She grabbed Nia's shoulder with a grip that was gentle by parent standards and iron by every other standard. "I'm so sorry," she said, and her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when the person speaking is holding themselves together through absolute force of will. "I am so incredibly sorry. This will not happen again. It will never happen again. Nia, come. Mama, I'm talking to the man." "Nia." "He looks lonely." Taehyun said nothing. He was looking at his own hand, which had gone still. He was aware of this in a way that was difficult to categorize. The trembling had stopped the moment the child spoke, which was medically meaningless and yet undeniable. His hand was resting against the chair arm and it was not shaking. "Your daughter," he said finally. Ariana's breath caught. "Yes. I know this is completely unacceptable. The daycare was closed this morning. I had no one to leave her with. I should have called in rather than brought her here, and I take full responsibility. What is her name?" A pause. "Naya." Taehyun looked at the child again. Naya had not moved. She was still watching him with that same level, uncomplicated attention, Gerald the elephant pressed against her chest, apparently entirely at ease in the private bedroom of the most dangerous man in Seoul's criminal underworld. "Nia," he said. "That's me," Nia confirmed. Something moved across Taehyun's face that was too brief and too controlled to fully identify. He looked at Ariana. "She can stay." I'm sorry. She can stay. Keep her off the ground floor and away from the east wing." He turned back to the window. "Close the door on your way out." Ariana stood in the doorway for 2 full seconds, trying to process what had just occurred and whether it was real. Then she reached for Nia's hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you very much." Taehyun didn't answer. He was looking at the river again, at the rain making its gray patterns on the glass, and his right hand rested on the chair arm, perfectly still. The next morning, Nia brought him a drawing. It was a crayon rendering of what Ariana identified upon close inspection as 2 people, one tall and one very small, standing next to what might have been a river, or might have been a road, under a yellow sun that occupied roughly 40% of the available sky. The tall figure had what appeared to be a crown, or possibly very aggressive hair. The small figure had what was unmistakably an elephant tucked under one arm. Nia knocked on the door of the north suite with the 3 deliberate knocks of someone who had been taught that this was the proper way to announce yourself. Taehyun opened the door. Nia held up the drawing. "I made this for you," she said, "because your room doesn't have enough colors." Taehyun took the drawing. He looked at it for a moment. "What is this?" "That's you," Nia said, pointing at the tall figure. "And that's me. And that's Gerald. He wanted to be in the picture." "Who is Gerald?" Nia held up the stuffed elephant. Taehyun looked at the elephant. The elephant, being stuffed, offered no additional information. He looked back at the drawing. "You think my room needs more colors?" "It's very gray," Nia said, with the frank diagnostic certainty of someone who has assessed a situation and reached a definitive conclusion. "Gray rooms make people feel gray inside." Taehyun looked up at that. The child was watching him with that same level attention from the day before. Not probing, not cautious, just present. Just looking at him the way people look at things they find genuinely interesting. "Come in," he said. This was, by any reasonable measure, not the decision of a man operating with his customary judgment. Jun Seo would have had considerable things to say about it if he had known. Ms. Yoon would have noted it with the particular stillness she reserved for developments that required careful processing. Every instinct Tae-hyun had spent 2 decades sharpening told him that allowing proximity was allowing vulnerability, that vulnerability was a resource his enemies were actively looking for, and that the wisest course of action was to close the door and resume the careful management of distance. He stepped back and let the 4-year-old into his room. Nia walked in with the purposeful air of someone on a professional visit. She looked at the walls. She looked at the window. She looked at the framed photograph of the woman who was smiling at something outside the frame, and then she looked at Tae-hyun. "Is that your mom?" The question landed with the blunt, unintentional precision of a child asking something that adults had long since learned not to say. Tae-hyun looked at the photograph. His mother had been dead for 6 years. She had died in the spring when the river was running fast with snowmelt, and he had been in the middle of a territorial dispute with a rival syndicate in Busan and had not made it to the hospital in time. This was the fact that lived underneath everything else, underneath the buildings and the empire and the long, carefully constructed architecture of power, like a stone at the bottom of still water, always there, visible when the light was right. "Yes," he said. "She looks nice," Nia said, with complete sincerity. She was. Nia nodded, apparently satisfied with this, and turned her attention back to the room's color situation. She pointed at the wall beside the desk. "If I brought more drawings, could they go there?" Tae-hyun followed her gesture. The wall was bare. He had not put anything on it deliberately. Bare walls were easier to maintain. They didn't accumulate meaning. "If you want," he said. Nia grinned. It was the kind of grin that reorganized the energy of a room, sudden and total and entirely without self-consciousness. "Okay," she said. "I'll make more." Bick. She made more. Over the following 2 weeks, the wall beside Tae-hyun's desk acquired a gallery that no interior designer would have predicted or recommended. Crayon animals of indeterminate species. A purple horse that Nia insisted was specifically lavender, the distinction apparently being important. A depiction of the Han River that bore no geometric relationship to the actual Han River, but captured something of its movement. A portrait of Gerald in what Nia described as his fancy hat, a triangle of construction paper that she had glued to the stuffed elephant's head and then apparently felt strongly enough about to memorialize in art. Each morning, Nia knocked 3 times. Each morning, Tae-hyun opened the door. He told himself this was managed. He told himself it was a controlled decision with clear parameters. The child came in the mornings, she talked, she drew or showed him things, and then she went back to the second floor where her mother was working. There was no professional ambiguity. There was no deviation from the household's operational protocols. It was simply a minor exception to routine, meaningless in the larger architecture of how the mansion functioned. He told himself this with less conviction each day, because Nia asked questions. Not the questions adults asked, the careful, strategic questions designed to extract information or position or advantage. Not even the questions journalists asked, which were designed to destabilize. She asked questions the way running water moves, without direction, without agenda, simply following the natural contour of whatever she encountered. "Why do you sit in that chair instead of the bed?" "Because the chair faces the window." "Do you like looking at the river?" "Yes." "Why?" He had thought about that. "Because it keeps moving." She had considered this with apparent seriousness. Does moving feel better than stopping? He hadn't answered that one, but he had thought about it for the rest of the morning. "Do you have friends?" she asked another day. "I have colleagues." "What's a colleague?" "People you work with." She frowned slightly. "That's different from friends." "Yes." "Don't you want friends?" Tae-hyun had looked at her. "It's complicated." "Mama says that when she doesn't want to explain something," Nia said. "But sometimes she explains it later." He had almost smiled. He was aware of it, the specific muscular movement that his face wanted to make, and that he arrested before it completed. He was aware that he had arrested it, which was itself notable. He hadn't been in the habit of noticing. For the past 4 months, his face had been doing what it had always done, holding the expression that served whatever function was required, and he had not thought about it. The child made him notice things he had stopped noticing. "Do bosses get scared?" she asked one morning, not looking up from the drawing she was working on, Gerald propped against the leg of the desk beside her. Tae-hyun was at the window. He had a call with his Busan lieutenant in 40 minutes and was reviewing the briefing document on his phone, though he was aware that his attention had been divided since Nia arrived. "Why do you ask that?" "Because you look scared sometimes. But then you stop looking scared and look mean instead." He lowered his phone. She was still drawing, her tongue pressed lightly between her teeth in the manner of someone concentrating. She had drawn a small figure on the paper and was now adding what appeared to be spikes around it, or possibly rays, as if the figure was radiating something. "I'm not scared," he said. She looked up. The look she gave him was not accusatory. It was simply clear. The clear, uncomplicated gaze of someone who has received an answer that doesn't match what they observed and is quietly noting the discrepancy without making a scene about it. "Okay," she said, and went back to her drawing. He stood at the window for another moment. Outside, the river moved with its usual indifferent continuity. A cargo vessel was making its slow way upstream, pushing against the current with a steadiness that had nothing to do with wanting to and everything to do with the fact that it had been built for exactly this. He looked back at the child on his floor, making her art with her washable markers and her absolute confidence in the importance of the endeavor. "Sometimes," he said. Nia looked up again. "Sometimes bosses get scared," he said, "but you can't show it." She considered this. "Why not?" "Because if people know you're afraid, they stop trusting you." "Mama cries sometimes," Nia said, "and I still trust her." He had nothing to say to that. She went back to her drawing. The cargo vessel continued upstream. The briefing document waited on his phone, and the call with the Busan lieutenant waited in 40 minutes, and the syndicate's board waited for the succession decisions that everyone was pretending weren't already being made in corridor conversations he was no longer part of. He sat down in the reading chair. He watched a 4-year-old draw for 17 minutes and did not pick up his phone. The first episode happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late November. Tae-hyun had been in his private gym on the mansion's lower level, putting himself through the modified routine that the physical therapist Jun-so had quietly arranged. No weights, no high-impact work, nothing that would tax the neurological pathways in ways the disease could exploit. Just movement. Controlled, deliberate movement that was supposed to maintain what remained of his motor function and slow the rate at which the rest was being taken. He had pushed it too far. He knew it when his right leg buckled on the third set of step exercises, sending him into the safety rail with a force that reverberated through his shoulder. He held the rail and breathed and told himself it was nothing, told himself it was a momentary loss of concentration, told himself he would complete the set. His left hand began shaking, then his right. Then the familiar spreading pain that the neurologist had described as a signal disruption cascade. The disease's particular way of announcing itself when he'd exceeded his body's current tolerances, moved from his hands up through his forearms, and Tae-hyun released the rail and lowered himself to the floor with the controlled deliberateness of a man who had accepted that this was now sometimes necessary and had decided that accepting it quietly was better than fighting it noisily. He sat on the gym floor and breathed through it. The pain was not the worst it had been. The worst had been worse. He had a scale for this now. A private, internal metric that he had developed over months of experience with his own deterioration, and this registered somewhere in the middle. Survivable. Temporary. Something to endure rather than respond to. He sat there for 20 minutes until his hand steadied. When he returned to the upper floor, he found Nia in the corridor outside his suite. She was sitting against the wall with Gerald, waiting in the specific patient way of someone who has no concept of time pressure. She looked up when she heard him coming. "You're walking funny," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not walking the same as before." He stopped in front of the door to his suite. His legs were still unreliable in a way he could feel in the tendons. A subtle looseness, a slight delay between intention and execution. He was compensating and apparently not compensating well enough to fool a 4-year-old. "Your mother's on the second floor, what?" he said. "She's cleaning the blue bathroom. She said I could sit here." He looked at her. She was watching him with that steady attention Gerald pressed to her chest, and there was something in her expression that wasn't pity. He was certain of that, would have been certain even if she'd been 30 years older, but was something else. Something that didn't have a name he was immediately comfortable applying. "Come in," he said, because the alternative was to leave her sitting in the corridor, and that was something he apparently was no longer willing to do. She came in. He lowered himself into the reading chair with the careful movements he had learned to use when his legs were unreliable. Nia climbed up onto the end of the bed, without asking, because she was Naya, and the concept of a space she wasn't welcome in had apparently not been communicated successfully, and sat with her legs crossed, Gerald in her lap. "Does it hurt?" she said. "Does what hurt?" "Your body, when you walk funny." He looked at her for a long moment. He had been asked this question once before, by the physical therapist during an assessment, and had answered with a number on a scale of 1 to 10, because that was the format the question had been posed in, and numerical scales were something he could engage with without the transaction feeling like exposure. This was different. "Yes," he said. Nia nodded slowly. "When I fell off the slide last year, it hurt for a long time. Mama put ice on it and it helped a little, but not all the way." "Did it stop eventually?" "Yeah, but it took a while." He looked at the window. The afternoon light was failing early, the way it did in late November, everything going gray-silver before 4 o'clock. "This won't stop," he said. He was not sure why he said it. He had not said it out loud before. Not to Junseo, not to Mrs. Yoon, not to the syndicate's medical consultant who filed careful reports that Tae-hyun reviewed and then filed away. He had thought it, every day, in the specific, blunt internal voice of someone who had accepted an unacceptable fact and was working on figuring out what to do with it. He had not said it. Nia was quiet for a moment. Then she climbed off the end of the bed and came and sat beside him on the wide arm of the reading chair. The way children occupy space without calculation, just going where proximity feels natural. She didn't say anything. She leaned her head against his arm, Gerald tucked between them, and sat with him while the light changed in the window and the river below did its indifferent moving thing. Tae-hyun sat very still. He was aware, with the specific clarity of a man whose defenses have been specifically designed to prevent this kind of awareness, that something was happening that he did not have a protocol for. He was aware that he was sitting in his reading chair with a 4-year-old child leaning against his arm, and that this was the first time in he could not calculate how long, and the fact that he couldn't calculate it told him something, that another person's physical presence had felt like something other than a variable to be managed. Outside, Seoul prepared itself for evening. Somewhere in the city's criminal underworld, men were holding conversations about the Black Phoenix syndicate that Tae-hyun's surveillance network was picking up in fragments. Coded language, careful language, the language of people measuring the distance between a weakened predator and an opportunity. Inside this room, a child he had known for 2 weeks sat against his arm and simply kept him company. He didn't move. He didn't reach for his phone. He sat in the chair while the light went from silver to gray to the particular deep blue that preceded full dark. And he breathed, and the child breathed beside him, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately account for, Kang Tae-hyun was not actively constructing the next wall. Ariana found them like that. She knocked once and pushed the door open carefully. She had been looking for Nia for 10 minutes, the corridor was empty, and the most logical remaining possibility was the North Suite, because that was where Nia went, and she had learned by now to check there when her daughter was unaccounted for. What she saw stopped her in the doorway. Chokon. Tae-hyun was in the reading chair. Nia was asleep against his shoulder, Gerald still tucked between them, her small face completely slack with the total surrender of a child's sleep. And Tae-hyun, the man who controlled criminal enterprises across 3 cities, who made decisions about other people's lives and deaths with the same emotional register he brought to reviewing financial reports, who had not once in the weeks she had worked here displayed anything resembling softness, was sitting with absolute stillness, his arms loose at his sides, not moving, not speaking, not doing anything that might disturb the child sleeping against him. He looked up when he heard the door. Their eyes met across the room. Ariana had her apology ready, the reflexive, comprehensive apology she had been developing since the first day, the one that acknowledged every possible dimension of the imposition and preemptively accepted whatever consequence was coming. She had the words organized. She opened her mouth. She was tired, Tae-hyun said quietly. She fell asleep. Ariana looked at her daughter, at the man, at the space between them that was not the space between employer and employee, was not that space at all, had perhaps never been that space from the moment Nia walked through the wrong door and said what she said. "I'll take her," Ariana said. She's fine. It's almost 5. I need to get her home for dinner. He looked at Nia. Something moved across his face. That same too brief thing she had seen once or twice before. The expression he allowed to exist for less than a second before containing it. He reached out and very carefully, with the focused deliberateness of someone navigating a hand that didn't always respond precisely, tucked the edge of the blanket that had somehow materialized, she didn't know when, she hadn't been in the room, more securely around the child's shoulders. Ariana crossed the room and lifted Nia, who stirred but didn't wake, folding against her mother's shoulder with the boneless trust of deep sleep. She was moving toward the door when she heard him speak. "How are you?" The words were delivered flatly, not quite a question, as if he had started to ask it and the grammar of it had come out wrong because he was out of practice. She turned around. He was looking at the window. His right hand was on the chair arm, and she could see, she was close enough now, with the room's lights on, to see what the distance of the hallway had always obscured, that his hand was not entirely steady. "I'm okay," she said. And then, because the room had created something in the last few minutes that made deflection feel like the wrong register. "Long day, but okay." He nodded once. She waited for a moment that she couldn't have explained the reason for. Nia's weight was warm against her shoulder. The room was very quiet. "How are you?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved from the window to his hand on the chair arm, and something passed through his face. Not the brief controlled thing she'd seen before, but something slower and less managed. Something that looked like the expression of a man who has been asked a question he forgot was something people asked. "Better," he said, "when she's here." A pause that stretched a beat too long. "When both of you are here." Ariana stood in the doorway of Kang Tae-hyun's room, with her daughter asleep on her shoulder, and the most dangerous man she had ever been in proximity to sitting in a chair across the room, admitting something she was not sure he had intended to admit, and she didn't know what to do with any of it. She said, "Good night," and meant it as something more than courtesy. He said, "Good night," and it landed the same way. She carried Nia out. The door closed softly behind her. Taehyun sat in the chair in the room that was now significantly more colored than it had been 3 weeks ago, his hand resting on the arm, the gallery of crayon drawings on the wall beside his desk catching the lamplight in ways that the bare wall never had. His phone buzzed on the desk. He looked at it without moving. The notification was from Jun Seo. The encrypted summary he received every evening, a condensed briefing on threat intelligence, syndicate activity, competitor movements. He read these without fail. He had read them every evening for 9 years. He left the phone on the desk. He sat in the chair and looked at the drawing Nia had done that morning, the latest addition to the wall, a green creature that was either a very large frog or a small dragon. She had been genuinely uncertain when asked, and he thought about what she had said. Gray rooms make people feel gray inside. Outside the mansion, in the city's underworld, men who had spent years calculating the right moment to move against the Black Phoenix Syndicate were looking at their calculations and deciding that the moment was getting close. They were not wrong, but they didn't know about the drawings on the wall, or the tiny footsteps in the corridor each morning, or the way a 4-year-old's weight against a man's shoulder could make his hand stop shaking. They didn't know that the most fortified room in the most secure building in their calculations had been breached. Not by violence, not by intelligence operations, not by the careful strategic pressure they had been applying for months. By a child with washable markers and an elephant named Gerald, who simply looked at a lonely man and said so out loud. In the weeks ahead, that breach would change everything, and the men sharpening their knives in the dark had no idea it had already happened. Ariana could not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the Mapo apartment with Nia curled against her side. Nia had migrated from her own mattress in the corner sometime around midnight, as she often did, finding her mother by some unerring small child navigation, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that she had been meaning to report to the landlord for 6 weeks, and thought about a man sitting in a chair not moving so that a sleeping child wouldn't be disturbed. She had known difficult men. She had been in proximity to dangerous men. She had loved one and survived the education of it. And what she had taken from that education, among other things, was a specific and well-calibrated alarm system for the particular combination of control and volatility that looked like strength from the outside and was something else entirely once you were inside its radius. Kang Tae-hyun triggered none of those alarms. This was itself the thing she kept returning to in the dark of the apartment, with Nia's small hand open against her ribs and the city doing its muffled nighttime sounds outside the window. She was looking for the shape of something familiar, the performance of warmth over a calculating core, the strategic deployment of vulnerability, the way certain kinds of men could make you feel specifically chosen when what you were was specifically useful. She had the pattern memorized. She could recognize it in the first 10 minutes now, the way you could recognize a chord progression once you'd heard it enough times. She wasn't finding it. What she was finding instead was harder to categorize. A man who had been told his body was failing him and had responded by building walls so complete that the only thing that had gotten through them was something he couldn't have anticipated and wouldn't have allowed if he'd seen it coming. A man who sat with a sleeping child for no reason that served any strategic interest she could identify. A man who said, "I'm better when both of you are here in the flat." Unpracticed tone of someone who had simply run out of the energy required to not say the true thing. She pressed her palm to the top of Nia's head, feeling the warmth of her daughter's sleep. She told herself she was overcomplicating it. She was an employee in his household. He was her employer. What had happened in that room today was simply a specific situation. A child, a tired man, an accidental softening. And it would recalibrate in the morning to whatever the appropriate professional distance was. She would make sure of it. She was very good at appropriate professional distance. She had been practicing it for 3 years. She told herself this with the specific awareness that she was telling herself something she didn't entirely believe. Outside, a truck moved through the street below, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling. Nia shifted and pressed closer without waking. Ariana closed her eyes. She thought about the drawings on the wall beside his desk, about the fact that he had kept them, each one, in order, taped carefully to the bare wall in a space that had apparently been waiting for something to fill it without knowing what. She thought about the way he had looked at the photograph of his mother when Nia asked, the specific quality of stillness that had come over his face, not the professional stillness he wore as a default, but something older and less defended. She thought about his hand on the chair arm, the trembling she had seen from across the room. She thought about what it cost a man like that to say the things he had said. She pressed her eyes shut harder and made herself think about something else. She thought about rent, about Nia's winter coat, which was fine for now but would need to be replaced by January. About the education savings account she had opened 2 months ago and was contributing $40 a month to, which was not going to build toward anything significant at that rate, but felt important as an act of intention. She thought about the English tutoring work she sometimes picked up on weekends, the Korean language class she kept meaning to enroll in and kept finding reasons to defer. She thought about practical things until she fell asleep, because practical things were what she had built her life around and they had not let her down yet. She dreamed about the Han River. Wotab. December arrived and the mansion changed temperature. Not physically, the heating systems were immaculate. The kind of infrastructure that maintained perfect environmental conditions regardless of the season, as indifferent to winter as it was to everything else. But something shifted in the atmosphere of the place, some quality of the air in the corridors and common spaces that Ariana felt before she could name it. The staff noticed Nia. This was perhaps inevitable. Mrs. Choi's daycare had recovered from the pipe damage within 3 days, but by then Nia's presence in the mansion had become a fact. Tae-hyun had said nothing to reverse it, Ms. Yoon had said nothing to address it, and Ariana had decided that the best available strategy was to continue bringing Nia quietly and see how long the situation remained tenable. It became tenable in ways she hadn't predicted. Mr. Park, the head chef, was the first to make a move. On the 3rd morning of Nia's official presence, he appeared at the entrance to the kitchen hallway while Ariana was passing with the cleaning cart and said, with the straightforward manner of a man who had decided something and was implementing it without fanfare, "The child should have breakfast before you start the upper floors. Come." Ariana had started to explain that they'd eaten before leaving the apartment, but Mr. Park was already moving back toward the kitchen, and the statement had been constructed in a way that didn't leave much room for counter-argument. He made Nia a plate of jeon, small, savory pancakes, and a bowl of fruit cut into pieces small enough for a 4-year-old to manage without assistance. He placed it at the far end of the prep counter where it didn't interfere with the kitchen's operations, and then returned to his work without looking at either of them. Nia ate with the focused appreciation of someone who understood that good food was a serious matter. When she finished, she looked at Mr. Park's back and said, "Thank you. These were really good." Mr. Park, without turning around, made a sound that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite dismissal, and was somehow both. The next morning, the pancakes were shaped like a bear. Nia's reaction to the bear-shaped pancake was everything Mr. Park appeared to have calculated it would be. She became, from that point forward, his most vocal admirer, informing anyone within earshot that the chef in this house was the best chef in Seoul, and possibly the world, which Ariana suspected was not entirely inaccurate based on the quality of the staff meals she had started being included in. The security rotation was next. The overnight team, 3 men who came on at 8 in the evening and ran until 7 in the morning, led by a former military officer named Sergeant Huang, who Ariana had previously classified as approximately as warm and approachable as the mansion's perimeter walls, began acknowledging Nia's morning arrivals with increasing specificity. It started with a nod from Huang when he was wrapping up his overnight and Nia was arriving with her mother. Then a brief exchange. Nia had asked him what the earpiece was for, and he had explained it in terms a 4-year-old could engage with, and the exchange had taken approximately 90 seconds and had been observed by the 2 junior members of the overnight team with the focused attention of men watching a classified event. By the second week of December, Huang had established a small ritual. When Nia arrived in the mornings, he would stand at attention and give a formal salute. Nia, who had decided this was the funniest thing that had ever happened to her, responded by putting on the miniature plastic sunglasses she carried in her backpack and saluting back with great seriousness. Ariana had watched this exchange one morning from the end of the corridor and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't been aware was tight. The mansion was not becoming a different place. It was becoming a fuller one, as if the presence of a small person who treated every locked door as a question mark and every adult as a potential friend had reminded the building's inhabitants that they were, in fact, people, that the professional configurations they maintained were not the entirety of what they were. Miss Yoon noticed. She said nothing, which was her way of noting things she had decided to permit. Taehyun noticed. He said very little, which was different from saying nothing. He started waiting for the sound of her footsteps. He was aware of this and did not examine it too closely, the way you don't examine certain mechanisms while they're running because you're not confident what stopping them to look would do to their function. He simply noted it as a fact of his mornings, that there was a point, usually around 9 o'clock, when he would hear the small, irregular rhythm of Nia approaching the north suite, 3 deliberate knocks, and something in his chest did something that he categorized as the cessation of attention he hadn't known he was holding. She brought things, not always drawings, though the drawings continued to accumulate on the wall beside his desk in their expanding, chaotic, vivid gallery. Sometimes she brought objects. A leaf she'd found in the garden that she described as the most interesting shape I've ever seen. A small, smooth stone from the path near the south gate that she'd convinced the groundskeeper to let her keep. A paper crane that missed her. Park's assistant had apparently taught her to fold, and that had taken 11 attempts to produce one she was satisfied with. Sometimes she brought questions. Why do you have so many phones? Different purposes. She had considered this. Like how Mama has a phone for talking to Grandma and a phone for work stuff. He had 2 phones for encrypted syndicate communication, one for legitimate business and one that only 3 people in the world had the number to. Similar, he said. Do you talk to your grandma? My grandmother died before I was born. Oh. She thought about this. Mama says dead people are still with us in the ways they changed us. So your grandma's still kind of in you. He had looked at her for a moment. Where did she get that from? She says she made it up. A pause. I think she made it up because it makes sad things easier. He had said nothing. He sat with that for a while. Do you think it's true? Nia asked. I think, he said carefully, that some things people say to make sad things easier turn out to also be true. She had nodded at this with the gravity of someone filing an important piece of information. I'm going to remember that, she said. He had looked at the photograph on the wall, his mother smiling at something outside the frame, caught by a camera she didn't know was there. In a moment of private happiness, that he had managed to preserve precisely because she hadn't known it was being preserved. He thought about his grandmother, who had shaped his mother, who had shaped him, in chains of influence that ran backward into the past further than he could trace, and forward into a future that the disease was busy renegotiating. He thought about what it meant to carry someone inside you after they were gone, not as memory exactly, but as pattern, as the specific contour of your responses, as the reason you reached for certain things and flinched from others. He thought about what he was carrying forward and what he was leaving behind, and whether those were the same question or different ones. "Me too," he said quietly. Nia grinned and went back to her paper crane. Deet. The second episode came on a Thursday. It came faster than the first and hit harder. Tae-hyun had been on a call with his Busan lieutenant, a man named Cho Sung-min, who had been with the syndicate for 11 years and whose loyalty Tae-hyun trusted approximately 60%, which was the highest rating he gave anyone outside his immediate operational circle. When the signal disruption started in his hands and moved up his arms with the now familiar terrible efficiency of a system that had learned the route, he ended the call. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He breathed through it the way he'd been taught. The controlled respiration that wasn't about relaxation, but about giving his body a consistent oxygen baseline while the neurological disruption ran its course. The pain was worse than Tuesday's. He registered this on his internal scale without drama. It was information. He processed information. What he was not prepared for was the specific quality of the frustration that came with it this time. In previous episodes, the frustration had been cold. The precise, compressed anger of someone accustomed to total physical command watching that command erode. He had managed it the way he managed most things, by converting it into operational energy, by making it fuel rather than feeling. This time, it was hot. It moved through him with a force that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the simple animal fact of a body refusing to obey, of hands that had done exactly what he demanded of them for 34 years suddenly running their own agenda. And the gap between what he intended and what his body executed was not a gap he could negotiate or threaten or outmaneuver. It simply existed. It would always exist now, and it would only get larger. He sat on the edge of the bed and breathed and let the hot frustration move through him because there was nothing else to do with it. He heard the 3 knocks at 10:15. He almost didn't answer. He was not in a condition that he would have chosen to be observed in, and the instinct to manage perception, to allow access only when the presentation was controlled, was strong and old and had served him reliably for a long time. Tae-hyun? A small voice through the door. She had started using his name 2 weeks ago after asking what she should call him and receiving the information that most people called him Mr. Kang or Boss, both of which she had tried once each and apparently found unsatisfying. He said nothing. "I can hear you breathing," she said, "so I know you're there." He looked at the door. "I made something," she said. "It's a surprise." He got up from the bed with the careful movements his legs required right now and crossed to the door and opened it. Nia was in the corridor with a piece of paper held in both hands, face down, and the expression of someone managing a very important secret. She looked up at him. Her expression shifted, not to pity, he was certain of that, would have closed the door on pity, but to something that was simply attention. The particular kind of attention that registered what it saw without requiring it to be different. "Your face looks like it hurts," she said. "I'm fine." She looked at him. "Come in," he said. She came in. He lowered himself onto the edge of the bed. His legs were still unreliable enough that the chair felt like a gamble right now, and she stood in front of him and turned the paper over. It was a drawing of the mansion, recognizable as the mansion. She had gotten the large windows right and the river behind it, though the river was purple because purple was apparently the color she felt conveyed water most accurately. In one of the upper windows there was a figure. The figure had a small crown, or possibly aggressive hair, and was looking out at the purple river. "That's you," she said, pointing at the figure, "looking at the river." He looked at the drawing. The figure in the window was small and precise, and the lines of the mansion around it were slightly crooked, but earnest. The purple river moved horizontally across the bottom of the page with an energy that the actual Han River, for all its genuine qualities, couldn't quite match. "You drew this today? This morning?" I wanted to bring it before anything else happened. She said the last part with the specific gravity of someone who understood, in the way that children understand things without the full architecture of adult comprehension, that sometimes the window between wanting to do a thing and being able to do it was smaller than it looked. He held the drawing. He looked at the figure in the upper window, small and watching, positioned inside a building that the drawing made look like a shelter rather than a fortress, which was either a difference in perspective or a difference in information, and he was not certain which. "Sit down," he said. She climbed up onto the bed beside him. Gerald materialized from her backpack, and she sat with her legs crossed and waited with the patience of someone who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. The pain was moving through its cycle. He knew the phases now: the initial sharp arrival, the plateau that was the worst of it, the slow recession that left his muscles feeling like they'd been wrung out and replaced loosely. He was somewhere in the transition between plateau and recession, which meant the worst was behind him, and what remained was the particular exhaustion of having been through it. Nia leaned against his arm, not performing comfort, not managing the situation, simply putting herself in proximity to another person in the way that small children do when they decide that being near someone is the right thing to be. He sat very still. The drawing was in his hands. The purple river ran across the bottom of the page. The figure in the window looked out at it with whatever expression small, careful lines could convey. He thought, looking at it closely, that she had tried to draw it not sad and not happy, but somewhere between those things. Looking. Simply looking. She had seen him more clearly than most people who had known him for years. He did not know what to do with that except sit with it, which he was doing, and which was perhaps enough for right now. He was still sitting with it when Ariana appeared in the doorway. She had clearly been looking for Nia. He could see that in the way she arrived, moving quickly, checking the corridor behind her before looking into the room. And what she saw when she looked into the room stopped her with the same impact as the first time, that first accidental evening when she'd found them together by the window. And Tae-hyun watched her face process it with the specific helplessness of someone whose expression is giving information they hadn't decided to share. She looked at her daughter asleep against his arm. She looked at him. He looked back at her. He was aware that he looked worse than usual. The episodes left marks that were difficult to conceal, a particular quality of depletion in his face that the professional stillness didn't fully cover. He was aware that she was seeing this and that there was nothing he could do about it, and that he had, somewhere between the first morning Nia knocked on his door and this moment, stopped wanting to do anything about it, at least with this specific person. "She fell asleep again," he said. Ariana looked at the drawing still in his hands. She looked at the wall of drawings beside his desk, the expanding gallery, the lavender horse, Gerald in his fancy hat, the fish that was also kind of a bird. She looked at his face. "How are you today?" she asked quietly. He held the purple river drawing in his hands and thought about what his honest answer was. "Better," he said. "Whenever she's here." He paused. "Whenever both of you are here." Ariana stood in the doorway of the North Suite, and the look on her face was the look of someone who has been handed something they weren't prepared to carry and has decided to carry it anyway. "I'll let her sleep a little longer," she said softly. "Yes," he said. She didn't leave immediately. She stood in the doorway with the late afternoon light coming through the window behind him and landing on her face, and he could see the specific quality of her stillness, different from his stillness, which was constructed and deliberate. Hers was the stillness of someone standing in a moment they hadn't planned and trying to understand what it was asking of them. "You should eat something," she said. "I'll ask Mr. Park." "You don't have to." "You should eat," she said again, firmly, in the tone of someone who has made a decision and is not reopening it for discussion. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the level, direct gaze of a woman who had survived things that had required her to be harder than the circumstances she'd started with, and who wore that hardness not as armor but as simple fact. "Here is what I am," it said. "Here is what I've made of what I was given, and I'm not apologizing for any of it." He said, "All right." She went to speak to Mr. Park. Tae-hyun sat on the edge of the bed with his daughter asleep against his arm and the purple river in his hands. And outside the mansion, in the particular darkness that Seoul's criminal underworld occupied, the men who were calculating the right moment to move against the Black Phoenix Syndicate looked at their numbers and moved their timelines forward. They thought they knew what they were dealing with. They thought the man in the mansion was already finished. They didn't know that something had taken root in the North Suite that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with the specific stubborn persistence of being alive, of choosing, day after day, to let something matter. By the time they made their move, that choice would have already changed everything. But the change was still coming, and the men in the dark were still sharpening their knives. And Tae-hyun could feel both of those things with the precision of someone who had never in his life been able to afford the luxury of not knowing what was coming. He pressed that knowledge down beneath the weight of the moment. The sleeping child, the purple river, the sound of Ariana's voice in the corridor speaking to Mr. Park with the particular warm authority she used for things she had decided mattered. And let the moment be what it was. For now. For now, that was enough. The food came on a tray. Mr. Park had sent it up with one of his assistants, a young man named Hyun-woo, who moved through the mansion with the careful efficiency of someone still learning the specific weight of silence required in this particular building. The tray held a bowl of doenjang jigae, still steaming, a plate of banchan arranged with the precision that Mr. Park applied to everything regardless of audience, and a small dish of the sliced fruit that had apparently become standard whenever the tray went to the North Suite. Tae-hyun noted the fruit. He said nothing about it. He ate sitting at the desk, the purple river drawing set to one side, Nia still asleep on the edge of the bed behind him. He ate the way he did most things now, with the deliberate, measured attention of someone who had been told that rest and proper nutrition were among the limited variables still within his control, and who had converted that information into discipline because discipline was the only response he trusted himself to have. Ariana had come back once to check on Nia and had stayed in the doorway exactly long enough to confirm that her daughter was still sleeping, that Tae-hyun was eating, and that the room contained no new emergency. Then she had gone back to the second floor. He watched the door close behind her and then looked at his bowl. He finished the jigae. He drank the tea that had come with it. He sat at the desk for a while with the empty tray and the purple river drawing and the sound of his daughter's breathing behind him. And then he opened his laptop and looked at the evening briefing from Jun Seo that he had been avoiding for 3 hours. The briefing was 11 pages. 11 pages was 4 more than the standard briefing. The additional 4 pages were not reassuring. Jun Seo came to the North Suite at 8 that evening after Ariana and Nia had left, and the mansion had shifted into its nighttime configuration. He was 41 years old, built like someone who had spent 20 years making his body into a specific kind of tool and had never stopped maintaining it, with a face that had the particular quality of men who have seen a significant number of things they would have preferred not to see and have organized themselves around that fact. He had worked for Tae-hyun for 9 years. He knocked once, precisely, and waited. "Come in." Jun Seo entered and closed the door behind him. He stood just inside the room with his hands behind his back and his eyes moving across the space with the automatic sweep of a man who never fully turned off the assessment function. The drawings on the wall registered. His face gave nothing about what he thought of them. "The Busan meeting," Tae-hyun said. He was in the reading chair. He had his phone in his hand but wasn't looking at it. "Cho Sung-min met with representatives of the Jeong family 3 days ago," Jun Seo said. "Private restaurant in Haeundae. 2 hours. We have photographs and partial audio." "What did the partial audio give you?" "Enough." Jun Seo reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, printed, not digital, because Jun Seo maintained analog backups for everything that mattered. He placed it on the desk without crossing the room to hand it to Tae-hyun directly, which was a habit Tae-hyun had established years ago, and Jun Seo had absorbed so completely that he no longer thought about it. Sung-min is positioning himself as a transitional authority. The Jeong family is offering resources in exchange for operational access to the Busan port routes once the transition is complete. Once the transition is complete, Tae-hyun repeated. His language. He used that phrase 3 times in the partial audio. Jun Seo's voice was flat and professional. "He is not being subtle, sir. He's being efficient. He expects the window to be short." Tae-hyun looked at the folded document on the desk. He didn't pick it up. "Who else?" "The Seoul board is divided. Yoon Byung-chul and Lee Min-seok are holding position. I believe that's genuine, not strategic. The other 3 have been difficult to read in the past 2 weeks. Their communication patterns have changed. In what direction? Less communication with us? More communication with each other. Taehyun was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the Han River was a strip of reflected light in the darkness, the city's glow turning its surface the color of old bronze. The Jeong family's timetable, he said. We believe they're looking at the new year, January at the latest. They want the port routes operational before the spring shipping cycle. Junseo paused. The pause was brief and deliberate. Junseo did not pause without reason. There's something else. Say it. They know about the condition. Another pause. Not the specifics, but the general fact of it. Someone inside the mansion has been providing information. The room was very quiet. Taehyun did not move. His face did not change. These were both things he had control over, and he exercised that control now with the precision of someone who understood that the first response to this kind of information was the most important one, because the first response was the one that set the temperature of everything that followed. Source, he said. We're narrowing it. The information reaching the Jeong family has a specific character. It's operational rather than personal. Schedules, access patterns. It's someone with routine access to the household's daily structure, not someone in the inner operational circle. Taehyun thought about this. He thought about the 11 people who moved through this building on any given day. He thought about the specific quality of information Junseo had described. Schedules, access patterns, funds, the kind of intelligence that accrued through daily proximity rather than privileged access. He thought about a background check that Ms. Yoon had run in September, and the specific phrase, no connections to criminal organizations that the check had returned. The check could have missed things. Checks sometimes missed things. He kept his face at the temperature he had set it at. Keep narrowing, he said. I want a name before the week is out. Yes, sir. Junseo didn't move. And the Sungmin situation. I'll handle Sungmin. The Jeong family. I said I'll handle it. The temperature in his voice dropped half a degree. Not to anger, which was a luxury he couldn't afford in operational conversations, but to the specific quality of finality that told the people who worked for him that a decision had been made and the conversation about that decision was over. Junseo absorbed this with the practiced ease of 9 years. Is there anything else you need tonight? Taehyun looked at the wall beside his desk. The gallery of drawings, the lavender horse, the green creature that was either a frog or a dragon, the fish bird, Gerald in his fancy hat, the mansion with the purple river. Nia had started signing them in the lower right corner, careful blocky letters. NIA. As if she'd decided they were worth claiming. No, he said. Good night. Junseo left. Taehyun sat in the chair for a long time after the door closed. Bob. He called Ms. Yoon at 9:15. She answered on the second ring, which was standard. She had worked for him for 11 years and had never once, to his knowledge, been caught unprepared by his calls regardless of the hour. The September background check on the new housekeeper, he said. Ariana Brooks. A pause so brief it was almost not a pause. Yes. Pull everything again. Go deeper than the standard verification. Financial history, communication records, any prior associations in Atlanta before she relocated. Everything. Another pause. This one was a fraction longer. Understood. He was about to end the call. He stopped. Miss Yoon. Sir? Who ran the original check? I coordinated it with Mr. Bake's team. Standard protocol for household staff. The result came back clean. Yes. Run it again yourself. Not through Bake's team. Directly. The pause this time was not brief. Miss Yoon was processing something, not the instruction which she would execute without question, but something adjacent to it. Some implication she was reading in the specific construction of what he'd said. I'll have preliminary results by morning, she said. Thank you. He ended the call. He sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the wall of drawings and thought about a woman who stood in doorways and asked how he was with the specific directness of someone who had decided the professional distance was no longer the honest configuration of the situation. And he thought about the information reaching the Jeong family, schedules, access patterns, daily structure. And he thought about the gap between who a person appeared to be and who a thorough enough investigation revealed them to be, and he had lived long enough in the world he lived in to know that the gap was almost always wider than it looked from the inside. He had let her daughter into his room. He had told her daughter that bosses got scared. He had said, "I'm better when both of you are here," to a woman he had known for 6 weeks, in a room where he had allowed himself to be seen in ways he had not allowed himself to be seen by anyone in years. And he had done all of this without running the appropriate verification first, because something about the situation had bypassed the process, and he had let it bypass the process, and that was his mistake. And mistakes in his world did not stay abstract for long. He set the phone down. He looked at the purple river drawing. He did not move it. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of December morning that arrived with a quality of determination, as if the weather had decided that Seoul had been comfortable long enough. Ariana arrived at 7:15 as always. Nia had Gerald in one arm and a new drawing tucked under the other. She had finished it at the apartment kitchen table that morning, she informed Ariana, before breakfast, because she'd had the idea in the night and needed to get it down before it disappeared. The drawing was of 2 hands, one large, one small, not holding it, just parallel, close together, the way 2 things can be near each other without yet touching. Ariana had looked at this drawing for a long moment over her morning coffee. She didn't ask Nia about it. With Nia's drawings, asking sometimes narrowed something that was better left wide. She tucked it back under Nia's arm and put their coats on, and they took the bus. The mansion felt different that morning. She couldn't have said exactly how. The corridors were the same corridors. The security rotation was running its standard configuration. Mr. Park was in the kitchen producing the smells that meant breakfast was underway. Ms. Yoon was in her office on the ground floor with the door open 3 inches, which was her standard operating position. But something in the texture of the air was different. She had been in enough buildings with bad atmospheres, had lived in one for 2 years, had learned to read the specific quality of charged silence that preceded something she needed to prepare herself for. And this was not that. This was something else. Subtler. A specific kind of alertness in the way the security staff moved that morning, a quality of attention that had been calibrated up a fraction. She noted it and kept moving. Nia went to find Mr. Park about breakfast. Ariana started the 2nd floor. She was halfway through the corridor when Ms. Yoon appeared at the top of the stairs. Ms. Yoon was 53 years old, small and precise, with silver-streaked hair she wore pulled back, and the particular quality of composure that came from having spent over a decade managing the household of a man like Kang Tae-hyun and surviving it intact. She had never been unkind to Ariana. She had also never been warm. Not cold exactly, but professional in the specific way that meant she was always assessing, always filing, always operating from behind a careful distance. She looked at Ariana now and said, "A moment, please." They stood in the corridor. "I need to ask you some questions," Ms. Yoon said, "about your background. There are some gaps in your verification that need to be addressed." Ariana felt the shift, the specific physical response that certain phrases triggered in her, a tightening in her chest that was not quite fear, but lived in the same neighborhood. She kept her face even. "What kind of gaps?" "Financial history, primarily. There are some periods that the original check didn't fully account for, and some prior associations in Atlanta that need clarification." "I've been in Seoul 3 years," Ariana said. "I don't have associations in Atlanta anymore." "The check is routine," Ms. Yoon said, in the tone of someone saying something that is technically true and also not the whole truth. "It shouldn't take long. I'll need some additional documentation from you. Employment history, banking records for the past 5 years, references beyond the 2 you originally provided." Ariana looked at her. She had spent enough of her life learning to read what people were and weren't saying to understand that this conversation was not about gaps in documentation. "Did something happen?" she said. Ms. Yoon's face gave nothing. Additional verification is standard practice when staff have extended access to sensitive areas of the household. "I've been here 2 months." "Yes." "And this is happening now." "Yes." They looked at each other. The corridor was quiet, except for the distant sound of Nia's voice from the direction of the kitchen, narrating something to Mr. Park with the enthusiasm of someone who had found a completely attentive audience. "I'll get you whatever you need," Ariana said. "Thank you." Ms. Yoon paused. "One more thing. For the time being, could you keep Nia on the service level? The upper floors need to be kept clear this week for some operational reasons. The upper floors. The North Suite. Ariana looked at Ms. Yoon for a moment longer than the conversation required. Of course, she said. Ms. Yoon went back downstairs. Ariana stood in the corridor with her cleaning cart and the quiet that had expanded into the space the conversation had occupied, and she breathed through the specific feeling of a door closing. Not slammed, not locked, just eased shut with the controlled pressure of a decision being made somewhere above her that she hadn't been consulted about. She had known this building's atmosphere from the first day. She had known what it was. She had let herself forget, somewhere in the past 6 weeks, exactly how much that mattered. Nia didn't understand why she couldn't go to the North Suite. She asked once, directly, in the manner of someone who believed that direct questions deserve direct answers. Ariana told her that Mr. Tae-hyun was busy today. Nia accepted this with visible skepticism, but accepted it. At 10 o'clock, Nia went to the service-level lounge with Gerald and her markers and set up her morning operation on the low table in the corner. She was working on a new drawing, something ambitious, she had announced, that would require significant concentration. Ariana was finishing the second-floor bathroom when her phone vibrated in her pocket. Unknown number, Seoul area code. She answered because unknown numbers sometimes mattered, and she had learned not to ignore things that might matter. Ms. Brooks? The voice was male, Korean-accented English, with the specific quality of someone who had learned the language professionally rather than organically. I apologize for the direct contact. My name is not important. What is important is that you understand what you've walked into. Ariana's hand tightened on the phone. She moved into the bathroom and closed the door. Who is this? She said. Someone who would like you and your daughter to make better decisions about your proximity to Kang Tae-hyun. A pause. The man is dying, Ms. Brooks. His organization knows it. His enemies know it. And the people circling what he's built are not the kind of people who leave witnesses to the transition. Her heartbeat was steady. She had learned, under conditions that had required it, to keep her heartbeat steady. I don't know what you think I'm involved in, she said, but I'm a housekeeper. You're a woman who has daily access to a dying crime boss's private quarters, whose daughter has formed an attachment that the entire household has noticed, and who made a considerable impression on a man who hasn't let anyone make an impression on him in years. The voice was not unkind. It was worse than unkind. It was reasonable. You are not invisible, Ms. Brooks. You never were. And invisible was the only version of this situation that was safe for you. The bathroom was very clean. She had just cleaned it herself, every surface wiped down to the institutional standard that the mansion required. She stood in the center of it and held the phone and thought about Nia in the service lounge with Gerald and her ambitious drawing. What do you want? She said. Nothing dramatic. I want you to understand the landscape. And I want you to ask yourself, whatever you think is happening in that North Suite, whatever you've told yourself about what this man is or could be, whether it's worth what comes next. The line went dead. Ariana stood in the bathroom for 30 seconds. Then she put her phone in her pocket, opened the door, walked back to her cleaning cart, and resumed work on the corridor with the methodical, physical focus of someone converting an impossible situation into the only thing that could be done about it right now, which was continuing to do the work in front of her. She was on the third room when she heard the sound from the north end of the corridor. Not a crash, not a shout, just a sound. A specific contained sound. The sound of something hitting the floor with the particular weight of a person. She was moving before she finished processing what it meant. The North Suite door was unlocked. She pushed it open. Tae-hyun was on the floor beside the reading chair. He had gone down sideways. She could see from the angle of the chair that he'd been trying to stand, and his legs had simply stopped cooperating. He was on his side, and he was conscious, and his jaw was set with the specific expression of a man doing everything in his power not to make a sound, which told her the pain was significant. She was across the room in 4 steps. "Don't," he said. "I'm not asking," she said, and got her hands under his arm. He was heavier than she'd expected. Not overweight, but dense. The specific weight of a body that had been rigorously maintained. She got him upright with the focused effort of someone who had physically gotten other people upright before under circumstances that required it, and he did not fight her, which told her more about the severity of the episode than anything he would have said voluntarily. She got him to the edge of the bed. He sat. His hands were shaking. His breathing was controlled in the specific way that controlling breathing was the only thing available. She stood in front of him, not stepping back, not giving him the professional distance that the situation technically called for. She looked at his face, the depletion in it, the particular gray quality of someone who had been fighting something for a long time and was running out of the energy the fight required. "How long has it been like this?" she said. Not gently, direct. The way she asked things when soft wasn't what the situation needed. He looked up at her, and in his eyes, in the dark and the exhaustion of them, she saw something that answered a question she hadn't known she was asking. Not about the disease, not about the syndicate, not about the things the voice on the phone had said. Something that told her the door she was standing in front of had already opened, and that the men who wanted it closed were already on their way. The second call was to a man named Park Sung-jae. Sung-jae was 61 years old and had been operating in Seoul's financial underworld since before Tae-hyun was born. He was not a crime boss. He was something more precise and considerably more dangerous, which was a man who knew where every significant criminal organization in the Korean peninsula kept its money and had spent 4 decades making himself indispensable to all of them simultaneously. He moved between power structures the way water moved between rocks, finding the path, taking the shape, never being the thing that broke, but always being present when the breaking happened. Tae-hyun had done him a significant service 7 years ago involving a tax authority investigation and certain documents that had needed to not exist. Sung-jae had acknowledged the debt with the specific formal gravity of a man who understood that debts of that magnitude accrued interest. He answered on the first ring. "I've been expecting this call," Sung-jae said. His voice had the particular texture of someone who had smoked for 40 years and had stopped 20 years ago and still carried the evidence of both decisions. "The Jong family's financial structure," Tae-hyun said. "The legitimate shell companies, the port authority relationships, the investment vehicles they've been using to position for the transition. I know their structure. I need leverage points, the ones they can't explain publicly and can't afford to have examined." A pause. Not hesitation. Sung-jae did not hesitate. It wasn't in his operational vocabulary, but the pause of someone performing a rapid calculation of competing interests and arriving at a number. "This burns my neutrality with them." "Yes, I've maintained that neutrality for 11 years. I know." Another pause. "The debt covers it," Sung-jae said finally. "But it covers it exactly. We're clean after this." "Agreed. I'll have documents to your secure address within the hour. What you do with them is your problem." "That's all I need." The line went dead. Tae-hyun set the phone on the operations table and looked at Jun-seo, who had returned from securing Ms. Yoon and was standing at the door with the expression of a man who had been awake for 22 hours and was prepared to be awake for 22 more. "The board meeting," Tae-hyun said. "I need Yoon Byung-chul and Lee Min-seok here by 7, in person. Tell them it's not optional." "And the other 3? Invite them as well." A pause. "Use the formal channel. I want them to know I know." Jun-seo absorbed this. "You're moving everything up." "They moved it up when they sent vehicles to Mapo district." Tae-hyun moved to the operations table and pulled up the surveillance architecture on the central screen, the network of monitoring that Jun-seo maintained across the city, the nodes and connections and data streams that constituted the syndicate's nervous system. He looked at it the way he had always looked at complex systems, not at the individual components, but at the pattern they made together, the shape of the information rather than the information itself. "Where is Cho Sung-min right now?" "Still in Busan. Our monitoring has him at his residence." "Get me a direct line to his personal phone, not the encrypted channel. His personal phone." Jun-seo looked at him for a fraction of a second longer than he usually looked at things before executing them. Then he nodded and moved to the secondary console. Tae-hyun looked at the clock on the wall. 5:23 in the morning, roughly 90 minutes until the city's professional class began its day. Roughly 4 hours until a board meeting that would determine the next 10 years of everything he had built. His right hand was trembling slightly. He registered this on his internal scale and filed it without drama. He had things to do, and the trembling was not relevant to any of them. He went upstairs to change his clothes. He passed the guest room on the second floor. The door was open 2 inches odd. Ariana had left it that way, he understood, so that she could hear the corridor. He slowed without stopping and looked through the gap. Ariana was in the chair beside the bed, not asleep. She was sitting with her knees drawn up, her arms around them, looking at Nia. The lamp was on its lowest setting, throwing a warm, dim light across the room. Nia was completely, peacefully unconscious, one arm thrown over Gerald, her face slack and trusting. Ariana heard him in the corridor. She looked toward the door. They looked at each other through the 2-inch gap. He said nothing. She said nothing. There was a moment that existed in the space between what was happening and what it meant, and neither of them tried to fill it with language, which was the right decision because language would have made it smaller. He continued down the corridor. He changed into a dark suit, the one he wore for situations that required the version of himself that the suit communicated, not the managed, diminished version that had been administering its own decline for 8 months, but the version that had built something from nothing using the only tools available, which were intelligence and will, and the specific willingness to be more dangerous than whatever was coming at him. He stood at the mirror and looked at his hands. The right one was trembling. He breathed through it. He watched it. He thought about everything he needed his hands to do in the next 6 hours, and he breathed with the controlled, deliberate rhythm that the physical therapist had given him, and he waited. The trembling slowed. It didn't stop. It slowed. He decided that was enough. Cho Sung-min answered his personal phone at 6:05 with the voice of a man who had been awake, which told Tae-hyun that Busan already knew something was in motion. Tae-hyun, Sung-min said. He used the given name without the title, which was a statement. You met with the Jong family in Haeundae? Tae-hyun said. You used the phrase transitional authority 3 times in the recorded portion of the conversation. You've been building a succession structure for 8 months, using my organization's resources and my organization's relationships while drawing a salary that I pay. Silence on the line. I'm going to give you one opportunity to tell me something useful, Tae-hyun said. The Jong family's operational timeline, what they're planning for this week and where they're planning to execute it. A pause. Tae-hyun could hear Sung-min breathing, shallow, rapid, the breathing of a man running calculations at speed and not liking any of the numbers. You can't stop this, Sung-min said finally. You know that. The board is meeting in 2 hours. Tell me the timeline, Sung-min. They're coming to the board meeting. Sung-min's voice dropped, took on the specific quality of a man who has decided that the best available option is partial honesty. The Jong family. They have proxies on the board, not just influence, actual representatives who've been positioned as independent members. When the meeting convenes, they move to formalize the transition, make it look procedural, clean. How many proxies? 3. The 3 whose communication patterns had changed. And their play if the vote doesn't go their way. A longer pause. Tae-hyun, say it. They have documentation, medical records, the full neurological picture, including the 18-month prognosis. They're prepared to present it to the board as evidence of incapacity and request a formal competency review under the organization's charter. Sung-min paused. It would hand operational control to an interim committee, which they control. Tae-hyun was in the operations room by now, Jun-seo 3 feet away, both of them hearing the call through the speaker. He looked at Jun-seo. Jun-seo's face was stone. Medical records. Dr. Shin's private clinic. The records that didn't exist under real names. Ms. Yoon had known the clinic. She had arranged the transportation on the first visit. She had known everything. 14 months. Thank you, Tae-hyun said to Sung-min. That's all I needed. He ended the call. He looked at Jun-seo. The medical records, Jun-seo said. Ms. Yoon had the clinic information. She would have found a way to access or reconstruct the documentation. He paused. It doesn't matter. We don't fight that battle. Then which battle? The one I'm about to show you. Tae-hyun pulled up the secure document address on the operations console. Sung-jae's files had arrived, a compressed archive, meticulously organized in the way that a man who had spent 40 years in financial intelligence organized things. which was with the precision of someone who understood that the usefulness of information was entirely dependent on its accessibility at the exact moment you needed it. He opened the first document, then the second. Junseo leaned in and read over his shoulder and said nothing for 90 seconds. Then he said very quietly, "They've been laundering through the Port Authority contracts for 4 years. Yes. If this goes to the Financial Crimes Authority, their entire legitimate business structure collapses. Every investment vehicle, every partnership, every public-facing asset they've spent 11 years building." Taehyun looked at the documents. "They don't get a managed transition. They get an investigation." Junseo straightened. "You're going to threaten to burn them down. I'm going to make sure they understand that coming after me costs more than they're prepared to spend." He closed the archive. "Get the board here. All 5 of them, including the 3 proxies. 7 o'clock. And if the Jong family moves before the meeting, then we respond to what they do. But they won't." Taehyun looked at the clock. 6:18. "They're procedural people. They want the vote. They want it to look clean. They won't break procedure unless they have to. And if they have to, then they have to, and we deal with it." Junseo looked at him for a moment, the specific look of a man who has spent 9 years executing orders without questioning their origin, and who is, in this particular moment, doing something that exists at the edge of questioning. Not doubt. Something more like witnessing. "Yes, sir," he said. The board arrived between 6:50 and 7:05. Yoon Byung-chul came first, a compact man in his 50s with the careful movements of someone who had learned early that physical economy conveyed a specific kind of authority. He looked at Taehyun when he entered the main conference room, and his expression was the expression of a man who had been waiting for a particular version of events, and was relieved to find that version still standing. Lee Min-seok arrived 2 minutes later. He was younger, sharper-featured, with the specific alertness of someone whose primary professional skill was reading rooms. He read this one in approximately 4 seconds and settled into a chair with the contained energy of a man preparing for something. The 3 proxies arrived together, which was itself a statement. Their names were Choi Hyun-woo, no relation to the kitchen assistant, a coincidence that Taehyun had long since stopped finding interesting, Park Ji-yeon and Ryu Sang-il. They had been on the board for between 14 and 20 months. They had been positioned with the patience of people building something meant to look organic. They looked at Taehyun at the head of the table, and Taehyun watched them recalibrate, watched them take in the suit, the posture, the specific quality of his presence in the room, and compare it against whatever their intelligence had told them to expect. And he watched the recalibration produce something in their faces that they were not quite fast enough to fully contain. He let them sit with it. He let 30 seconds pass in complete silence, which was 30 seconds longer than the room was comfortable with, which was the point. Then he said, "I know about the Hyundai meeting, I know about the proxies, I know about the medical documentation you obtained and what you plan to do with it this morning." He let another 3 seconds pass. "I'm going to give you an opportunity to decide what happens next, which is more than you extended to me when you sent vehicles to a residential building in Mapo district at 1 in the morning. Choi Hyun-woo, the oldest of the 3 proxies, the one who had been positioned longest and had therefore had the most time to develop confidence in the position, leaned forward. "The organization's charter provides for a competency review when there is documented evidence of I know what the charter provides." Taehyun's voice did not rise. It did the opposite. It dropped, taking on the specific gravity of something that had reached the bottom of its range and was speaking from there. "I wrote the charter." Choi Hyun-woo closed his mouth. Taehyun reached into the folder in front of him and placed 3 documents on the table, one in front of each proxy. He did it with the unhurried movements of someone who was not performing calm but simply had it, who had made the decision that needed to be made at 5 in the morning and was now executing it without the anxiety of someone who was still deciding. The 3 proxies looked at the documents. Park Ji-yeon went still first. Then Ryu Sang-il. Choi Hyun-woo's face did something complex that moved through several stages before arriving at a controlled blankness. "Those are copies," Taehyun said. The originals are in 3 separate locations with 3 separate attorneys operating under instructions that activate if I fail to make contact with them on a schedule that began this morning. He paused. The Financial Crimes Authority would find the Port Authority documentation particularly interesting. I'm told the statute of limitations on the laundering structure is considerably longer than the Jong family's current planning horizon. The room was very quiet. Byung-chul and Min Seok said nothing. They were watching the 3 proxies with the focused attention of men who had just understood the shape of what they'd been sitting beside for the past 14 months. "What do you want?" Choi Hyun-woo said. His voice had changed register. The procedural confidence was gone. What was underneath it was older and less polished. "I want the Jung family to understand that this organization is not in transition," Taehyun said. "I want the proxies on this board replaced with a process that Byung-chul and Min Seok will oversee. I want Cho Sung-min's operational authority in Busan suspended pending a full review." He paused. "And I want confirmation that the residential address in Mapo District is removed from any operational consideration permanently. The woman and child at that address are not part of this." Choi Hyun-woo looked at the document in front of him. He looked at the 2 men across the table who were not going to help him. He looked at the door, which Jun Seo was standing in front of with the specific quality of stillness that very large men with very specific training could produce. "I'll need to make a call," Choi Hyun-woo said. "You have 5 minutes, Taehyun said. "Use the room across the hall. Jun Seo will accompany you." They filed out, all 3 of them, moving with the specific quality of people who had arrived expecting to execute a plan and were now navigating the collapse of it in real time. Jun Seo moved with them. Byung-chul waited until the door closed and then exhaled, a long, slow breath that carried 8 months of held tension in it. "How long have you known about the proxies?" "Long enough." "Min Seok and I know," Taehyun said. "I know where you stood." Min Seok leaned forward. "The Jong family isn't going to accept this. You can threaten the documentation, but they'll find a counter. They have resources they can't use without the documentation becoming public," Taehyun said. "They're rational actors. Rational actors don't burn down their own house to win an argument." He paused. "They'll recalculate. They'll look for another approach. But they won't move against this organization directly. Not now." "And the medical situation," Min Seok said carefully. The room held its breath. Taehyun looked at the table surface in front of him. The clean, dark wood, the 3 empty spaces where the documents had been. He looked at his right hand resting on the table edge. Still. Not perfectly still, but still enough. "The medical situation is mine to manage," he said. "What I need from this board is the understanding that managing it is not the same as ceding control of what I've built." He looked at both of them. "Can I have that understanding?" Byung-chul said without hesitation, "Yes." Min Seok said, 1 beat later, "Yes." The door opened. Jun Seo came back in. Behind him, the 3 proxies had the specific demeanor of men who had made a phone call and received instructions from the Jeong family that amounted to stand down, which Taehyun had known they would receive because he had known, from the moment he'd looked at Sung Jae's documents, that the Jong family would make the rational calculation. Choi Hyun-woo stood in the doorway. He looked at Taehyun across the room. "The family accepts your terms," he said. His voice was flat, professionally controlled. Behind the control was something that might have been anger or might have been a more complicated emotion. The specific feeling of a man who has spent over a year building something and has watched it come apart in a single morning. "Good," Taehyun said. "They want you to know." Choi Hyun-woo stopped. He seemed to be deciding whether to deliver the rest of the message. "Say it." "They want you to know that this is a postponement, not a resolution. The medical situation doesn't change. The timeline doesn't change. They're patient people." Taehyun looked at him. "I know they are," he said. "Tell them I am too." The proxies left. Jun Seo closed the door behind them and stood with his back to it and looked at Taehyun with the expression he almost never wore. The expression that existed below the professional layer. The one that had to do with something other than operational assessment. "That's not over," Jun Seo said. "No," Taehyun agreed. "It isn't. They'll regroup, find another angle." "Yes. And the documentation leverage has a shelf life. Once they've had time to restructure the financial vehicles, Junseo. Taehyun stood, his legs held. He registered this with the specific gratitude of someone who could not take it for granted. I know all of it. He looked at the window. Outside, Seoul was fully awake now, the city running its morning operation with the indifference of 10 million lives that had no relationship to what had just happened in this room. Right now I need coffee, and I need to know that the second floor is quiet. Junseo looked at him for a moment. The second floor is quiet, he said. Ms. Brooks has been there since she came in with the child. She hasn't asked for anything. She wouldn't, Taehyun said. He left the conference room. He took the stairs slowly with the measured pace his legs required after a night without sleep and the specific drain of an episode and a board meeting and everything that had come between them. The staircase took him longer than it used to. He did not hurry it. He was on the landing between floors when he heard Nia. She was awake. He could hear her voice from the direction of the second floor, that clear, unhurried narration she applied to most situations, currently directed at what sounded like Gerald, explaining something that required considerable detail and apparently Gerald's full attention. He stood on the landing and listened to the sound of it, the completely unbothered, completely present voice of a child who had been asleep while the world around her negotiated its terms and was now awake and wanted to tell a stuffed elephant something important. Something in his chest did the thing it did. He continued up the stairs. The guest room door was open. Ariana was sitting on the edge of the bed, and Nia was standing on the mattress in her pajamas, with Gerald in one arm and the focused energy of someone who had just had a significant sleep and was ready to apply herself to the day. She turned when she heard him in the corridor. Taehyun, she said, with the complete ease of someone for whom this was simply the normal name of a person she was happy to see. Gerald and I were talking about breakfast. He stopped in the doorway. Mr. Park makes the best breakfast, she continued. And Gerald has never had it because Gerald doesn't eat, but I was describing it to him so he could appreciate it in his imagination. She looked at Taehyun with the level attention she had applied to him since the first morning. You look tired. I'm all right. You look tired, she said again, with the specific patience of someone who has said a true thing and is willing to wait for it to be acknowledged. Ariana was watching him from the bed. She had the expression of a woman who had been awake in a chair all night and was reading his face with the attention of someone looking for specific information. Not about the board meeting, not about the operational situation, but about something more basic. Whether he was still standing, whether standing was still something he was doing on his own terms. Is it over? She said quietly. Nia was back to briefing Gerald on the subject of breakfast. For now, he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. In the look was everything that had accumulated across 2 months and a night, and a board meeting, and 2 vehicles in Mapo district, and a wall of drawings, and a purple river, and a child who had walked through the wrong door. Okay, she said. The word carried more weight than its syllables. I'll take her down to Mr. Park, Ariana said, standing. She held out her hand to Nia. Come on, baby. Nia climbed off the bed. She took her mother's hand. Then she looked at Taehyun. Are you coming to breakfast? She said. He looked at her. He thought about the conference room downstairs and the documents and the phone call to Incheon and everything he had spent in the last 6 hours. He thought about the men who were patient people and had longer timelines than this morning and would find another angle. He thought about the specific, immediate, uncomplicated fact of a 4-year-old asking if he was coming to breakfast. Yes, he said. Nia grinned, the full reorganizing grin that changed the energy of whatever room it happened in, and pulled her mother toward the stairs. Taehyun followed them. His right hand was trembling slightly at his side. He kept walking, and somewhere in the city below, in the offices and meetings, and encrypted communications of people who were already recalculating their timelines and restructuring their approaches and preparing for the next angle, no one knew that the most important thing that had happened this morning was not the board meeting or the documents or the stand down from the Jong family. It was a man with shaking hands choosing to go to breakfast. It was the specific, defiant, utterly ordinary act of going to the table when someone who mattered had asked him to come. And the people who were still sharpening their knives in the dark had no framework for understanding why that mattered, had no way of knowing that a man who had found something worth showing up for was a different and considerably more dangerous thing than a man who was simply trying not to lose. They would find out. But not this morning. This morning there was breakfast. Breakfast was not simple. Nothing in the mansion was simple anymore. The simplicity had been burned out of it across a single night, leaving something rawer and less managed in its place, the way a fire leaves a landscape that is stripped but also honest. Mr. Park cooked without being asked to, moving through the kitchen with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that feeding people was one of the few responses to crisis that was always appropriate regardless of the specific nature of the crisis. He made rice and soup in the animal-shaped jian that had become Nia's standard, and he plated everything with the same precision he brought to formal dinners for 20, because Mr. Park had only one standard, and it did not adjust downward for circumstances. Taehyun sat at the kitchen table, not the formal dining room. The kitchen table, a long, scarred wooden surface at the back of the kitchen where the staff ate their meals, where Nia had been having breakfast for 2 months, where no board meeting or syndicate briefing had ever been conducted because it was not that kind of space. It was the kind of space where food was eaten and sometimes things were said, and mostly the business of being alive was conducted without ceremony. He sat there and Nia sat across from him and told him about a dream she'd had involving a very large fish who had learned to fly, which she described in considerable structural detail while eating her jian with the focused application of someone for whom eating and narrating were not competing activities, but complementary ones. Ariana sat beside Nia and drank her coffee and said very little, which was her register for mornings after nights that had required too much of her. She was present and she was steady, and she was watching both of them, her daughter and the man across the table, with the specific quality of attention she brought to things she was still deciding what to do with. Taehyun ate. His hands were steadier than they'd been at 5 a.m. Not steady. Steadier. There was a distinction and he had learned to work with it. Junseo appeared at the kitchen doorway at 8:15, looked at the scene at the table, and delivered his morning briefing in a lower register than usual, standing at the threshold rather than entering, as if the kitchen operated under different rules than the rest of the building, and he was respecting the boundary. The Jong family's legal team had been in contact with their financial advisors since 6 a.m. The documents had done what documents did when they described things that could not survive examination. They had produced, almost immediately, the specific kind of activity that confirmed their accuracy. 2 of the shell companies referenced in Sungjae's files had already begun restructuring procedures. The Port Authority relationships were being quietly recategorized. The Jong family was doing what rational actors did when the cost-benefit calculation shifted catastrophically. They were cutting their losses in the direction that preserved what remained. The proxies had submitted their board resignations by 7:45. All 3. Choi Hyun-woo's had arrived first, phrased with the professional grace of a man who understood that the language of exit mattered almost as much as the exit itself. Cho Sung-min in Busan had not called back. He would not call back. That was its own answer. "Ms. Yoon," Taehyun said. Junseo's face moved slightly. "Stable. She hasn't asked for anything except a change of clothes. Arrange for her to be transported to a location outside Seoul by this afternoon. Clean exit. No harm, no legal exposure from our side. A severance payment that reflects 11 years of genuine service alongside everything else." He paused. "Set her up somewhere she can start again. She's good at what she does." Junseo absorbed this without expression. "You're letting her go." "I'm making a decision about what I do with a betrayal," Taehyun said. "That's different from letting something go." Junseo said, "Yes, sir," and stepped back from the doorway. Nia had been watching this exchange with the focused attention she applied to adult conversations she wasn't supposed to understand, but was clearly tracking at some frequency that bypassed the language barrier. She looked at Taehyun when Junseo left. "Who's Ms. Yoon?" she said. "Someone who worked here. Did she leave?" "She's going to." Nia considered this. "Is she okay?" Taehyun looked at the child across the table. The directness of the question, the complete absence of any agenda behind it, just a 4-year-old wanting to know if someone was okay because that was the category of information that mattered to her. "She will be," he said. Nia nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to the flying fish story. Ariana looked at Taehyun over her coffee cup. He looked back at her. The look between them was the look of 2 people who were standing on the other side of something significant and were still taking inventory of what they'd brought through with them. He looked away first. Not from discomfort, from the specific acknowledgement that some things needed more than a kitchen table and a morning after a crisis to be properly addressed, and he was going to give those things the time they required. Busy. 3 days passed. They passed with the specific quality of time after a storm. Not peaceful exactly, but with the particular relief of things being what they were rather than what they had been building toward. The mansion recalibrated. New security protocols went into place, quietly and without drama, adjusted to account for what had been exposed about the previous configuration. Byung-chul and Min-sok began the process of identifying replacement board members through a vetting process that Junseo ran this time, with no outsourced components. The Mapo District apartment was cleared of any remaining surveillance by Junseo's team within 24 hours. He reported this to Tae-hyun with the flat certainty of a man who had done the job himself rather than delegated it, which told Tae-hyun something about Junseo that he filed alongside everything else he had learned about the people around him across the past several weeks. Ariana took Nia back to the apartment on the second day. She came back to work on the third morning as if she was simply continuing the work she'd been doing, which was in one sense exactly what she was doing, and in another sense entirely inaccurate. She came to the North Suite at 10:15, not to clean. The room had been cleaned. But because she had something to say, and she had decided that the space where things had been said between them was the right place to say it, she knocked twice, not 3 times, her own rhythm. "Come in," Taehyun said. She came in. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the wall of drawings, and then looked at him in the reading chair and took a breath. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask. When this is done, however this goes with your health, whenever the organization stabilizes enough that the immediate threats are managed, what happens to us?" She said it without softening it because she had learned that softening things was not her register with him, and he didn't want it to be. Nia and me. In relation to this house, and you. He looked at her. He had been thinking about this for 3 days. He had been thinking about it in some form since the night she'd asked, "How are you?" and he'd answered honestly for the first time in months. "That depends on what you want," he said. "I'm asking what you want." He was quiet for a moment. Not the professional stillness, the actual quiet of a man organizing himself around a truth that had been living in him long enough to have taken up permanent residence. "I want Nia to keep coming in the mornings," he said. "I want the drawings to keep going on the wall. I want—" He stopped, started again with the careful directness of someone who has decided that precision matters more than elegance here. "I want to know that both of you are in the building. I want that to be a fact rather than a temporary arrangement." Ariana looked at him. "That's not a small thing." "No, it isn't. You understand what you're asking, what it means for Nia." "I understand it better than you might expect," he said. "I understand that she's 4 years old, and attachment at 4 years old isn't casual, and if I'm asking for her mornings and her drawings and her questions, then I'm asking for something that has a weight and a responsibility I don't get to put down when it's inconvenient." He paused. "I'm not asking casually." Ariana was very still. "And the other part," she said quietly, "the part that isn't about Naya." He looked at her. The low winter light was coming through the window, the same light that had been coming through this window for weeks, landing on the same floor and the same chair and now on her face, which was the face of a woman who had been through enough to know the difference between someone offering something real and someone performing the offer. "That part," he said, "I'd like to take slowly, if that's acceptable." Something shifted in her expression. Not relief, something steadier than relief. The expression of someone who has been given an answer that matches the actual shape of what they were asking. "That's acceptable," she said. She stayed in the room for another hour. Not cleaning, not working. She sat in the desk chair and he sat in the reading chair, and they talked. About Atlanta, about the things she'd built since leaving it. About Nia's father, who was not a subject she opened often, but opened now, briefly, and without drama. Because the room had the quality of a space where things could be put on the table and examined without requiring them to be resolved. About his mother, whose photograph still hung on the wall. About what it meant to build a life in a place that wasn't where you started, and whether starting over was the right frame for it, or whether it was actually just continuing in a different direction. About what remaining meant when remaining was not guaranteed. He told her about the disease in the way he had not told anyone except medical professionals. Not the clinical summary, not the managed version, but the actual texture of it. What it felt like when his hands stopped cooperating. What the episodes cost him, and what the cost accumulated to across a day, a week, a month. What Dr. Shin had said, and what he had done with the information, and what he was still deciding to do with it. She listened the way she listened to things, with her whole attention and without filling the silences with reassurance, because she understood that what he needed was not reassurance but witness. When he finished, she said, "Are you in treatment now?" "Partially." "Partially." "I stopped going to appointments for a while." "I know. You're going to start again." He looked at her. "That's not a question," she said. Something moved through his face, the almost smile, but this time it completed itself. Brief and genuine, and entirely without the performance of confidence that his smiles usually carried. Just the expression of a man who has been told something true by someone who meant it. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to start again." What? Christmas came to the mansion the way it came to places that have been through something. Quietly, without announcement, the season arriving and finding the people in it slightly different from who they'd been when it started. Mr. Park had been preparing for a week. He didn't announce his preparations or seek approval for them. He simply began, in the way that people who understand their domain begin things, by deciding the appropriate response to the moment and then executing it with everything he had. The kitchen staff decorated the prep area with paper garlands that Nia had helped make during the afternoons when she now spent time in the kitchen under Mr. Park's watchful and surprisingly patient supervision. She had learned, in the past 3 weeks, how to fold paper into shapes that sometimes resembled what they were supposed to resemble, and sometimes resembled Gerald. And Mr. Park had displayed all of them on the kitchen shelf, with the same seriousness he gave to the arrangement of his knives. Sergeant Huang and the security rotation had pooled their resources and bought Naya a set of toy walkie-talkies, which she had immediately incorporated into her morning salute ritual with a seriousness of protocol that Huang appeared to find entirely appropriate. The overnight team now conducted a brief formal exchange with her each morning. Huang at attention, Nia in her plastic sunglasses with a walkie-talkie in hand, both of them maintaining the specific dignity of people engaged in important official business. The mansion's strict household manager, a woman named Ms. Bayek, who had replaced Ms. Yoon's administrative functions and who had the particular quality of someone who had taken on a significant responsibility and was determined to prove they were equal to it, had organized a staff gift exchange with a spending limit and a lottery for assignments, and had herself drawn Taehyun's name, and had spent 3 days in visible distress about what to give a crime boss with unlimited resources before landing on a handmade calendar featuring photographs of the mansion's garden taken on her personal phone, which she had presented with the composed dignity of someone who had made peace with their decision. He had put it on his desk. Christmas Eve dinner was in the main dining room, but the table arrangement was different from any dinner that had been held in that room since Taehyun had owned the building. There was no formal seating hierarchy. The staff sat together, Mr. Park and his assistants, Sergeant Huang, and 2 members of the overnight team who had stayed voluntarily, Ms. Bayek with her characteristic precision occupying exactly the right amount of space, Jun Seo at the far end of the table with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to sitting at tables for reasons other than operational briefings and was making a genuine effort to adjust. Byung-chul and Min Seok had been invited and had come, bringing their families, which introduced 4 additional children into the evening's atmosphere and substantially increased the energy level of the proceedings. Nia was in her element. She had appointed herself social director approximately 30 seconds after the other children arrived, and had organized them into a project that involved the construction of what she described as a castle out of the decorative cushions from the main sitting room, a project that Mr. Park's youngest kitchen assistant had been recruited into against what appeared to be his better judgment, and that Sergeant Huang had been voluntarily conscripted into as the castle's official guard. Taehyun watched this from the dining room doorway. He had been in the kitchen helping, not supervising, not directing, actually helping, standing at the prep counter while Mr. Park gave him specific tasks of increasing complexity, starting with washing vegetables and moving, after it became clear he was not going to drop anything, to more substantive contributions. Mr. Park had given these instructions with exactly the tone he used for his kitchen assistants, which was to say, without excessive accommodation for the fact of who he was speaking to. And Tae-hyun had followed them with the specific humility of someone who was in another person's domain and knew it. His hands had been steady for most of it, not all of it. There had been a moment with a knife that required him to set it down and step back and breathe for 30 seconds, while Mr. Park continued working beside him without comment, without looking up, providing the specific dignity of a man who understood that the right response to someone managing a difficulty was to continue doing your own work and give them the space the management required. Tae-hyun had picked the knife back up after 30 seconds and finished the task. Now he stood in the doorway and watched Nia instruct a child twice her size on the structural requirements of the castle's northern wall, and he thought about what it meant that this had happened. That the building he had locked down and emptied of anything that could reach him had ended up here, full of noise and paper garlands and children's logistics and Mr. Park's food, and Jun Seo sitting at a table with the expression of a man making a genuine effort. He thought about the 11 months since Dr. Shin had told him 18 months, possibly less. He thought about what those 11 months had contained and what they had cost and what they had also, entirely unexpectedly, produced. Ariana appeared beside him. She had a glass of water for him. She had started doing this without asking, appearing with water or tea at specific intervals throughout the day with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone who had identified a gap and filled it, the way she filled most gaps, without announcement. He took the glass. "She's been running that castle operation for 40 minutes, Ariana said. "I know. The kid from Min Seok's family has been trying to resign twice, and she keeps not accepting it." "She doesn't accept things she doesn't believe in," he said. "She gets that from you." Ariana looked at him sideways. He looked straight ahead at the castle operation. The almost smile was there, and this time he didn't manage it back into stillness. She saw it. She said nothing about it. She stood beside him, and they watched together. Long. After dinner, after the other families had gone home, and the kitchen had been restored to Mr. Park's standards, and the castle had been partially disassembled, and the overnight rotation had settled into its configuration, Tae-hyun found himself in the main sitting room beside the fireplace with Nia in his lap. She had been fighting sleep for 45 minutes, with the specific determination of someone who understood that sleep was the end of the evening, and the evening was good, and therefore sleep was to be resisted. The resistance was failing. She was upright through will alone, her eyes at half-mast, Gerald tucked against her side with the boneless placement of something being held by a person whose arms were losing their structural integrity. She leaned back against him. He sat very still. The fire was doing what fires do. Its light moving across the walls of the room, finding the surfaces and giving them a warmth that the room's materials didn't have on their own. The paper garland Nia had made with the kitchen staff ran along the mantelpiece, slightly crooked, the colors bleeding where the tape had pulled at the paper. On the table beside him was a crayon drawing. Nia had made it that afternoon, her latest, placed on the table without ceremony or explanation when she'd finished it, the way she placed all of them now. He had looked at it and not said anything, which was sometimes the right response to her work. It was a drawing of a table. Around the table were figures, many of them varying in size and specificity, some barely more than colored shapes, and some rendered with more care. At the head of the table was the figure with the crown or aggressive hair. Beside it, a small figure with what was unmistakably Gerald. And around both of them, filling the table, all the other figures she had drawn in the colors she had chosen, which were not realistic and were entirely accurate. Ariana sat across this fireplace in the other chair. She was watching Nia lose the fight against sleep with the expression of a mother, watching something she has watched hundreds of times and finds unreduced in its power by repetition. She looked up and found Tae-hyun watching her. "She's going," Ariana said quietly. "I know." Nia made a small sound that was the sound of someone issuing a final protest against the inevitable, and then went completely still, her weight settling fully against him, her breathing shifting into the long, even rhythm of sleep. The room was very quiet. Tae-hyun looked at the child asleep against him, this small, absolute, entirely accidental fact of her, the way she had walked through a door she wasn't supposed to, and said a true thing about his eyes, and had not once across the weeks that followed, moderated herself into a smaller or less demanding version of who she was. She had simply continued being Naya. She had simply continued seeing him. He thought about the alarm button on the chair arm that he had not pressed. He thought about every decision that had followed from that one. The drawing on the wall, the questions he had answered honestly, the names said through a closed door in a clear, unhurried voice, the purple river, the two hands, the flying fish, the castle made of cushions. He thought about his mother's photograph on the wall of the North Suite, the smile caught by a camera she didn't know was there, in a moment she didn't know was being kept. He thought about what she would have made of this evening, of the paper garlands and the castle and Mr. Park's food and the child asleep against a man who had spent 8 months systematically removing everything that could reach him. He thought she would have found it funny, and then not funny, and then something that didn't have a name in the vocabulary he had access to. He looked at Ariana across the fireplace. She was looking at him with the expression he had come to understand as her default when she had decided something and was not yet saying it, clear and direct, and with the specific patience of someone who was going to say it when the time was right and was not going to be rushed. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just looking." At what? She looked at the child asleep against him, at his hands, the right one resting on Nia's back, not moving, not trembling, simply there. At his face, which was the face of a man who was in pain and was diminished and was also, in this specific moment, more present than she had seen him be outside of the room where they had their best conversations. "At you," she said, "being okay." He looked down at Nia, at Gerald, at the drawing on the table beside him, the crowded, imperfect, absolutely specific table with all its figures in their chosen colors. "Yeah," he said quietly. The fire moved. Outside, Seoul was doing what Seoul did at Christmas, lighting itself up in the particular extravagant way of a city that had decided the dark deserved a response. The Han River catching the city's light and giving it back doubled, the bridges and buildings and 10 million windows making their collective argument against the winter night. Inside the sitting room, the argument was simpler and did not require the city's scale to make. A man with a failing body and a cleared ledger and a wall full of crayon drawings sat beside a fire with a child asleep against him and a woman across from him who was looking at him the way people look at things they have decided are worth looking at. And the warmth in the room was not entirely from the fire and the quiet was not empty but full. The way things are full when they contain what they're supposed to contain. Junseo appeared in the doorway at 10:30. He looked at the room. He looked at Tae-hyun and held up the evening briefing tablet with the expression of a man making an offer he expected to be declined. Tae-hyun looked at the tablet. He looked at Nia. He looked at the fire. He shook his head once. Junseo lowered the tablet. He looked at the room again for a moment, at the paper garlands and the drawing on the table and the sleeping child and the woman in the other chair. And something moved across his face that was not his professional register. Something that existed below that in whatever space 9 years of loyal service had not fully occupied. He nodded once, to no one in particular. He turned and went back to his work. Ariana waited until his footsteps faded. Then she said, "You should have let him give you the briefing." "Tomorrow," Taehyun said. "The men with the patient timelines will still have patient timelines tomorrow." He looked at the fire. "Tonight is tonight." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Merry Christmas." He looked at her. He smiled. A genuine smile. Unmanaged, uncontrolled. The kind that his face produced when he stopped telling it what to do. And it changed the room the way Nia's grins changed rooms. Not because it was large, but because it was real. And real things in spaces that have been performing something else for a long time had an outsized effect. "Merry Christmas," he said. The fire burned. Nia slept. And in the morning, there would be more drawings and more questions, and more breakfasts at the kitchen table where things were said and sometimes resolved and sometimes simply held between people who had decided that holding them together was better than setting them down. There would be treatment appointments that Tae-hyun would keep, and board meetings that would require everything he had, and the patient men with their restructured timelines who would find the next angle and would discover, each time, that the calculation they had been running was missing a variable they hadn't known to account for. There would be all of it. The difficulty and the diminishment and the ongoing, unglamorous, costly work of being alive in a world that did not hold still. But tonight was tonight. And what tonight was this. A man who had locked the world out and been found anyway, sitting beside a fire with a child asleep against him and a woman across from him and a drawing on the table beside him. A table crowded with figures in imperfect colors, made by hands that did not know how to make things small, left there without explanation because no explanation was required. Worth more than the empire. Worth more than the leverage and the documents and the 11 months of careful management and everything the long, careful architecture of power had ever produced. Because in the end, the child had been right. His eyes had been lonely. And she had simply refused to leave them that way.